well. So let's just go briefly through the actual exercise for today. So the first portion of the exercise is aperture. So for the majority of the practical, you're going to be using a middle of the road focal length on the camera. So we're going to use 50 millimeters, which is the closest to what the human eye sees. So it's not an extreme on either end of the focal length spectrum. So we will be altering that towards the end of the exercise, but for the first several components, we're going to be using 50 millimeters. The first part here is to take a series of photos and adjusting the aperture, starting with a wide open aperture and then a medium-sized aperture and then stopping down to a small aperture. So as you, I'm sure, remember from class, the lower the number is actually representative of a larger aperture, which is allowing more light into the camera, but is also decreasing the amount that's in acceptable focus or decreasing your depth of field. So the higher the number, the smaller the aperture, the smaller the opening, the less light that's allowed into the camera, but it increases the amount that's in acceptable focus or your depth of field. So the first photo that you're going to take is at f3.5. The second one is going to be at f11, and the third one is going to be at f22. So those first initial three photographs are going to be taken with your subject focused, or the focused subject is going to be the lead or the number one object. So you should see a variance depending on what that aperture setting is. You will see a difference in what is considered to be an acceptable focus or that amount that's affecting the depth of field, like you will with the other photos as we go through. So the second one is to do the same series of photographs, but instead of focusing on object number one, you're going to be focusing on object number two, and again, making observations as to how that is affecting the foreground and the background for what is in focus. So again, for this one here, the same focal length, or sorry, using the same focal length of 50 millimeters, but also using varying aperture settings of f3.5, f11, and f22. The third series of photographs that you're going to take, again, focusing on the third object, making observations of the difference of what is an acceptable focus, taking photos at 3.5, f3.5, f11, and f22 as well. So we've covered the first few parts of the exercise using a 50 millimeter focal length. Section 4, or practical portion 4, is going to adjust the focal length of the camera. So what we're going to do this time, for this particular exercise, we're going to be focusing on object number 1. And we're going to be using an aperture of 3.5. And we're going to do a series of 3 photos, but adjusting the focal length of the camera. So the first photo is going to be at a 24 millimeter focal length. The second one is going to be at a 50 millimeter focal length. And the third one at a 65 millimeter focal length. And as I said, a constant of an aperture setting of 3.5 and focusing on the lead object. So the last component of this exercise is incorporating a distance variable. So we have used to date the camera positioning from the first object has been 24 inches or 2 feet. For the next series of photos, we're going to do it at a closer distance, so moving it up to the 1 foot distance to the first subject, and then following that, we're going to increase the distance to 3 feet, and repeating the same exercise. So for this one here, we are going to use an aperture setting of 3.5 and a focal length of 50 millimeters. But as we said, now we're changing the distance. Now, something that's a little bit different in this practical than some of the previous ones that we've done is we want you to make your observations and be able to illustrate how these different factors will impact on the depth of field. So rather than just submitting your photos as a file folder, a photo image file, we want you to create a Word document for each of the 5 different components of the practical, and on each page of the Word document, it is going to have, we want you to illustrate a side-by-side comparison of the images for that portion of the practical. So for instance, if you're changing the aperture setting with everything else remaining the same, then you should have 3 side-by-side photographs depicting that and illustrating that difference.